Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's webinar from the AMBIT team, helping people with multiple needs. Today, we're going to have a conversation with myself, who's James Wheeler, one of the AMBIT leads with the AMBIT, within the AMBIT team, with Andre Podu, who has been working in a youth and community setting for a number of years. To get started then, I think it would be a good idea just to introduce everybody who's here in the team today. So I think we're going to start with Laura.
Hi everybody, I'm Laura Talbot, one of the programme leads at AMBIT, also a clinical psychologist, and I'll be co-hosting today, so chipping in when James and Andre are having that, if there's some helpful bits I can highlight about AMBIT. Thanks for joining.
Hi everybody. Hi, my name's James Fairbairn and I'm one of the AMBIT team as well. I'm also a clinical psychologist. And so I'm going to be manning the chat function today. So we'd invite you to ask us questions and make comments to try to make the conversation a bit interactive. So if you've got thoughts or things that you'd like to contribute, please do. We really welcome that. One point on that is that this can be a little bit tricky, but when you publish your questions, could you try, if it's okay with you, to publish them to all panelists and attendees, so the question can be seen by everybody, if you're okay with that, just so that makes the discussion and the chat a bit more interactive. Thanks a lot for joining us.
And I'm Andre. I've been a youth work manager for coming up to 8 years now at a local voluntary sector organisation. I'm currently on my way to a new role, and so I'm going to be speaking a little bit about some of my previous experiences implementing AMBIT within a team of youth workers in that sort of setting. And yeah, really happy to be here. So thank you, James, and the rest of the Anna Freud team.
Great, thanks, Andre. So just to say, what we're going to do is that we're going to start by giving a bit of a brief presentation as to kind of a couple of things. So we're going to start off, you read the newsletter, what we said one of the themes would be is about the mentalizing, but also trust and epistemic trust within youth and community settings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by, hopefully the tech's going to work and I can share my screen, and I will be able to just give you a brief presentation on a couple of things that we're doing. So I'm going to start off with the right page. So yeah, so the title of this seminar then, or this webinar rather, is what does AMBIT in a youth and community setting look like? Who trusts who? So very briefly then, just to give a very quick overview of AMBIT, we at the centre of what we call the AMBIT wheel is mentalizing, and that's something we're going to be talking a little bit about today. But crucial about the AMBIT approach is that we stipulate and say that what we think you should be actually applying mentalizing, the concept of to 4 different quadrants. And so they are working with your client, working with networks, so thinking about how you work with professional networks, and then how you work with your team. And then the thing that kind of holds that all together is kind of learning at work. So that's just a quick overview, and some of you will be familiar with that. And throughout the chat and throughout the webinar, we're going to be putting up links to things that you might find interesting to the online manual. But I'll move on then to what we're thinking about today. Is the kind of the focus really is on the kind of the center of the wheel, and specifically working with your client. And the 2 things that AMBIT says you should be paying attention to in this particular domain are managing risk while at the same time scaffolding existing relationships. So in other words, what we mean is that, we know that the young people and the adults we might be working with come with lots of risky behaviours, but nonetheless they would also come with a lot of existing relationships. And so part of our job from an AMBIT point of view is to find out where we can scaffold and use those existing relationships, but while balancing that with managing risk. So Moving on then to a bit of an explanation of mentalizing. Now, some of you might be complete mentalizing experts, and so you'll be well aware of what mentalizing is. But it's something that humans do. It's kind of often said to be one of the least novel kind of concepts or ideas that's been come up with. But what's really important about it is that it's something you're doing when you're trying to make sense of what's going on in someone's mind. That could be our own mind, or it could be another person that might actually explain the behavior that you're seeing, the behavior that is visible to you. So key to AMBIT and to all kind of mentalizing practice is this idea that minds drive behavior. So in other words, mental processes drive the behavior that we see. And coupled with that, this idea as well of kind of minds being opaque. So we, you know, however much someone might suggest that they can actually see in someone's mind, even with the best Jedi mind tricks, we know that's not possible. So our capacity to mentalize is also influenced by two kind of things. Now, I'm going to go to the bottom little point there, which says our current emotional state. Right now, I'm slightly stressed, so my mentalizing capacity is probably going to be a little bit lower. And we know that kind of stress or any kind of emotional state does actually affect the way our ability to mentalize. But also, and very crucially, is that our developmental experiences are very much affect our ability and our capacity to mentalize. So if you've had adverse experiences in your infancy or in your childhood, then this is likely, very much likely to be able to actually influence your ability to mentalize, but also to trust. And we're going to come on and talk a little bit about that. So just a little bit more on mentalizing. If anybody ever has been on mentalizing or AMBIT training, then you would say that we would always kind of look at mentalizing being something with several different sides. So it's really important from where we're coming from that you can mentalize someone else, and that might be something that people are kind of more comfortable with and they immediately kind of understand or able to kind of latch onto. And you know, that might put the form of kind of, you know, asking these types of questions. But also you can mentalize yourself, and that might be something that people find a little bit less easy to kind of get their heads around. But the idea that you can mentalize yourself. So in a sense, what I did just a couple of moments ago, when I said, well, actually, I'm feeling a little bit stressed, and the reason I might be feeling a little bit stressed is because I'm staring into a camera and not sure exactly who's on the other side. So that's a bit of a weird situation for me anyway. Other people are getting much more kind of used to it. So that might be an example of me kind of mentalizing myself, wondering why is it that I'm feeling a little bit stressed or a little bit kind of uneasy. So the other way we can think about is you can be mentalized by someone else. And certainly when we do AMBIT training, we do lots of kind of exercises that try and give people the experience of being mentalized. And we would suggest that all of you have hopefully been mentalized quite a lot in your everyday life. And then finally, what we'd say is that you can help other people to mentalize you and another. Yeah, so this idea of you being able to help other people's mentalizing capacity to kind of improve, and also for them to kind of get and understand you a little bit better. Okay, so that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of mentalizing or mentalization. Now I want to kind of just move on a little bit to kind of what we can maybe term as kind of the next stage, or kind of something that leads on from when mentalizing is going quite well. And this is this idea of epistemic trust. So don't be too worried by the word epistemic. Essentially, what we mean in this idea is the kind of is the learning of kind of social knowledge. So the ability to be able to actually see, be able to think about and learn, receive and learn social knowledge that might actually give us a better sense or change our perception in some way of ourselves as a person and how we connect with the social world. I'm just going to read this quote here quickly, and this is from Peter Fonagy, who's the CEO of the Anna Freud Centre, amongst many other posts that he holds. So, the greatest benefit from a therapeutic relationships comes from generalising epistemic trust beyond therapy, such that the patient can continue to learn and grow from other relationships. Now, I guess I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this idea of talking about a patient, because I don't come from a kind of medical or kind of mental health kind of setting. So we would say, maybe I would say, so a young person or a family, and also this idea of a therapeutic relationship. In AMBIT, we think that all kind of relationships that are helping in some way are the important bit. So this idea of we don't really choose to talk about therapy, we talk about help, and in all those forms. And that's really important for today's discussion, because we're going to talk to Andre in a minute, and him and his team and his experiences are helping a great deal of young people and families and community members, but we wouldn't necessarily say, they wouldn't identify themselves as doing kind of therapy per se. So I guess I just wanted to kind of point that out, that we think that's really important, but it is about this idea of what's help and how does help work. So let's see, what do we actually mean when we talk about epistemic trust? So this idea that actually you're likely to kind of feel like you can kind of learn or pay attention to somebody or what somebody is saying and the way in which they're acting to you by feeling got. So this idea that you have a kind of, if you can be mentalized, if someone can accurately get a sense of what it is that you're thinking and what you're feeling, both your emotional states and perhaps your aspirations as well, and that really is key. And so this idea of, we've got a little graphic here, which just shows this idea of when the door to learning is closed. So if somebody has a range of experiences which are always where they feel like no one really understands them or gets them, gets their kind of emotional states and gets what it's like to be them. Or even is actually like, I don't know what it's like to be you. So if you think about perhaps some of the adverse experiences we're going to talk about a little bit later, this will be something that hopefully people can kind of get a sense to. So this metaphor of the door being closed is that this idea that when these experiences have been negative and people don't feel like they're actually kind of got, and that people doesn't understand them, and what we would say haven't been mentalized, then their ability to learn and accept help is likely to be extremely limited. So what we're saying is that once, you know, the helper on one side of the screen here is able to kind of actually accurately get a sense of understanding the person who's being helped and provide that, and actually do something in the language that they're talking and the way that they're acting that kind of shows to the person who's being helped that they are, that they're kind of, that they're curious, but also they're accurately trying to get what it's like to be that person. So once that person, the person being helped, has a sense that they're kind of getting that just about right, then there's a mechanism that kind of goes on where trust is built, and epistemic trust is built. It's this idea of like being able to actually go, okay, so what is it that you've got? I can recognize myself as you've seen me, but also if you can understand me like that, so they get a bit of what it's like to be me, then maybe some other stuff that you might say would be helpful to me. And I often think of, you know, the teacher example. I kind of had an issue with kind of dyslexia and that kind of thing. So it felt like I was quite bright, but couldn't spell and couldn't do those kind of things. And I can tell you right away that the person who recognized that, where first actually proved to me that she kind of got a bit of me, is someone that I would never forget. And I was sort of 10 years old, and I'm a lot older than that now. So really the idea is that that's a very powerful emotion. What they were able to say, not really an emotion as such, but a very powerful kind of process of trust. And it's not just trust in the individual, but because of the actions and because of the relationship and the working relationship that's going on, you're able to, the person being helped is able to think, well, actually, if I'm able to do this with this person, it may well be possible that I can do I can also trust others. So that's really key to what we're talking about. And the aim of all kind of helping relationships is that what you want is to be able to help a person in such a way that they're able not just to accept help from you, but also from others. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. And what I want to do now is just kind of like end slightly by just saying, how do we actually just talk about this idea of epistemic trust, and how do we kind of define it? And we've kind of come up with this idea, and this quote comes from the manual. And so it's epistemic trust describes a state in which the person who is the learner, so the person who's the helper, holds a sense of trust that what is being offered by the teacher or the helper has social value to them, i.e. the sense of trust that information is meaningful and relevant for me. So in the context of AMBIT, when we're talking about working with originally young people, but also adults with multiple needs, this idea of trust or epistemic trust or being got, this idea of this relevance to me is something that's really important. And conversely, what we would say as well is that where there is kind of epistemic mistrust, which is often the experience of young people who may have a range of negative and adverse experiences with authority figures, whether that be teachers or police or whoever, maybe because they're black, maybe because they're a woman, maybe because of lots of different reasons. But when someone doesn't feel that epistemic trust and that's not able to be built, we know that there are lots of problems that can arise from that. So I'm going to stop that there because I don't want to talk for too long. And what I'd like to do is stop sharing my screen. And I was just wondering if we could kind of start off and we could bring Andre in to see if we can have a bit of a chat with you, Andre, about some of your experience. Now, I don't know if it makes sense for you just to say a little bit about the kind of context that you work in, or you have been working in, a bit of the breadth of the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, sure. So it's been taking place in a community organisation with a kind of long-standing reputation in the kind of immediate area. You know, approaching 50 years of kind of track record, and that's been delivering services to people of different ages. And I say the word kind of service very loosely, actually, because particularly in the youth department where I was working, we took a conscious effort over the last kind of 3 or 4 years to move closer to a kind of community model as opposed to kind of service provider, service user model. But yeah, it can get a bit wordy if I keep on qualifying things like that. So yeah, as hopefully that gives a tiny kind of feel for some of the stuff that's going on. You know, it's not linear programs. The relationships aren't time bound, and often people will kind of be very present for a while, and then kind of other stuff will happen, and they won't be around for a little while, but then they'll drop back in, sometimes a year later, and kind of get re-engaged in the community, often with a form of help that they or at least a need which is presenting itself, even if it isn't necessarily manifesting in a direct ask at that point. But you know, often young people kind of say something like, yeah, it was just felt like it was a good time to pop in and say hello because it's been a while, and it kind of takes a while for that stuff to come out then. I guess, yeah, probably helpful to mention that we have an incredibly diverse team of practitioners across age, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation or identity, which I think is it's worthwhile putting a note in there, especially since we're talking about trust and acknowledging where there might be experiences that are marginalized. And as an organization, really, particularly in the kind of latest strategic period, the focus has been about trying to invest in the collective agency and efficacy of our community. So, you know, trust is really a foundational concept there. It's about making sure that as far as possible we are, you know, enhancing community conditions to build trust between, you know, service providers, as it were, and service users, but also between service users and themselves and the broader community and other more diverse stakeholders. So yeah, a complex and slightly muddy picture at times, but an absolute joy to be around, and just some incredible work happening.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice description of your organisation, thinking about, you know, just the huge diversity of work, but also a diverse kind of workforce and staff team. I wondered if you kind of just had sort of any kind of reflection. I should say this organisation has been AMBIT trained, so there's been, you know, quite a lot. You know, you've been one of the kind of, I guess, first community organisations that had AMBIT training kind of quite a long ago, and subsequent trainings on top of that. So I guess it'd just be, I'd be really interested to get some of your reflections on, you know, bearing in mind what you just heard me kind of babble on about in terms of epistemic trust and mentalizing. How would you kind of characterize your experience with kind of talking about mentalizing, maybe just with young people, or kind of like that? Because I know that you supervise a lot of staff as well.
Yep.
So thinking about how it works with, or how you try to have a mentalizing approach with young people, but then also with staff as well.
It's a really interesting question. So with staff, I think you know, in some ways the context presents loads of opportunities to really underscore the importance of mentalization. You know, if you imagine you have this very live environment with, you know, often you walk in the beginning of the day with a clear plan about what you think you need to do, and, you know, within the first hour that's completely blown out of the water, and stuff's happening. And so there's obviously a lot of anxiety there being held by staff about things that need to be done, needs that are presenting themselves, tensions, conflicts, and so in that context, where, you know, for myself as the manager of the team at the time, my role was, I saw my role primarily as a support mechanism to make sure the work was happening and that young people were being supported. There were loads of opportunities, and I think that kind of ability for AMBIT and mentalization as a framework and a tool to fit into that lived experience and that environment has been critical in using it. It's, yeah, and that's kind of how I think, yeah, we've underpinned it and reinforced it beyond the kind of initial training period. Is that there are things that are constantly coming up which are causing you know, stress and anxiety for the team, and using it as a tool to better separate kind of the anxieties that staff are holding, which sometimes perhaps also relating to themselves, from the anxieties that young people and their networks may be holding, has been, yeah, just really, really critical and really useful, and yeah, practically useful, you know. And I think, you know, for young people, some of that is mirrored there again. You know, obviously people walking through the doors with an urgent problem or need which is presenting itself, sometimes, but also those kind of small chats in the wings of whatever a main activity might be, those kind of small corners where, you know, there's a small moment you're able to explore what's happening for the young person, either in that situation or what's going on in their broader life, which might be affecting how they're participating or engaging. Mentalizing's, yeah, again, that's been one of the kind of places where it's shown out as something that's been really valuable for the team. Sure.
So yeah, I'm struck by a few things you say there, Andre. So certainly one in terms of thinking about how broadly you this idea of anxiety and being kind of explicit about anxiety that both workers and young people in this particular example are feeling. And I wonder how much that actually, you know, being able to do that with staff members, but also with young people, helps there to be helps trust to actually build somewhat. Because I don't know if you agree with this, but I think it feels to me that if you're able to be explicit about those things, and that be okay, to talk about those things, then perhaps that means this idea of being real and real with people about the work that you're doing, and also what you can and can't do. I wonder if that's kind of some of the experiences you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy when we're kind of thinking about young people with kind of multiple needs to think about the chaos that's often present in kind of their personal context. But you know, in my experience, institutional contexts are chaotic as well, especially in the kind of voluntary sector where we were practicing. You know, we've got funding cycles which are kind of 3 years max. We've got kind of policies that kick in at a certain point and almost completely change behaviour when implemented incorrectly. There's obviously staff turnover, and there's all sorts of other kind of competing, you know, influences into kind of institutional life for workers and practitioners and organisations. And so there is a lot of anxiety that's being played out from staff, and for a young person who may be having difficulties trusting people in positions of power, it can make it even more complex to understand the behaviours that they're witnessing from the people that they're trying to seek help from. So I think being able to surface those anxieties and address them in a kind of intentional fashion is incredibly important in building epistemic trust. And I think there's something else as well which is important, which is, you know, reflexive practice and the ability to understand that workers are themselves a part of the intervention, the service, and so their own practice is up for grabs, it's up for conversation. And you know, particularly important in a time like this now, where we're really thinking about power, who holds it, how is it being used. And I think without that ability for workers in a safe way to interrogate, you know, what are their intentions, whether they're kind of conscious or unconscious, and how is it impacting their behavior is incredibly important. And without that, it's really hard to challenge the you know, the harmful, the oppressive forms of power that we may be reproducing. So I think in that way as well, it's incredibly important for trust, because it shows, you know, for a lot of young people, the criticism that I've heard over the years was, if you really wanted to help, you would do X. And we know that, you know, not all of that is necessarily what you want to have as your driving force, but it is at points as well a helpful point of analysis, or a point of questioning to ask, if that is our desired intention, then why aren't we doing X, and what's its relationship to maintaining patriarchy, racism, ableism, etc., etc.
Sure. Well, thanks for kind of kicking us out a bit of pretend mode, which is a very AMBIT way of thinking things, because like certainly it was on my list to talk about, but really I think, you know, this idea about power and epistemic trust, and let's be very straightforward, you know, kind of racism and some kind of prejudice in whatever manner that might take. And I'd be interested to hear your point of view. And this is, I guess I want to make this point as well, is that these kind of issues, you know, obviously there's been somewhat of an awakening, which is largely positive due to the death of George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd. But I think it's important that organisations like yours have been doing this kind of work for a long, long time. And so this is these kind of issues of power are no particular surprise to you. So I just wondered if, like, this idea of kind of epistemic trust and kind of trust more generally, when you're working, for example, with young people who are on the fringes of, or have previously been involved in, or are involved in kind of what's termed in the UK serious youth violence, you know, how this issue of trust in that particular context and in that kind of work has been interesting for you, or has it been, you know, what's your experience of this idea of, because I have some views, but I want to hear what you've got to say, Andre.
I think possibly the first thing that's really interesting to me is, you know, those are problems of social exclusion. People marginalized in society and not given fair recourse to resources that kind of majority groups have access to. But I think the really interesting things is that, you know, when we think about most of the forms of exclusion that I've kind of seen through my practice, they've been quite passive. You know, they're not necessarily about the kind of active exclusion and the kind of hard ones. Those happen at the extremes, but a lot of it tends to be quite subtle and yeah, quite passive, and sometimes about inaction rather than malfeasant action in and of itself. So and I think that's, for me, one of the things there. It's interesting looking at the AMBIT wheel and, you know, managing risk. Yeah. And I think, again, this idea of kind of anxiety in staff and managing it properly is really important, because it's quite, I've seen it happen before where kind of staff anxiety gets confused and muddled with risk. And those are not the same things. And a lot of anxiety can be caused by unfamiliarity or the size of the problem, or etc. etc. It doesn't necessarily mean that the risks that are posed are material or significant, or you know. And so I think kind of being able to hold that is one of the crucial ways in building trust and being able to unpick that, because what can happen if that doesn't occur is that kind of subtle passive form of exclusion takes place. It's the kind of the calls that don't get followed up, or it's the referrals that just don't happen quick enough. It's the, you know, it's all the little things and it's kind of that which builds up the picture, and I think actually drives people to the margins. And so a fair amount of our work in tackling that stuff has been about kind of chipping away at those expectations of that passive marginalization that's going to take place of that. And so, and you know, in the process of doing that, that's one of the ways I think trust begins to be established. So I would definitely pinpoint that as one of the kind of areas which we've really had to think about. You know, in nearly 8 years, we haven't excluded anyone from our service, and I think that's like a marker. And that's not to say, you know, that everything's been perfect or everything's been rosy. But I think there is something about that, about, you know, making sure that there's always paths open, that there's always proactive work taking place, and that fundamentally the view of the young person is positive, even if it's still realistic. I don't know if I've been too woolly here, and I don't know if there's any more pointed questions.
I don't think so. I think you've been it's really interesting to hear that, and I'm kind of, you know, I'm struck by, you know, just the last thing you said there, Andre, about, you know, not excluding somebody in that period of time. I think talk to most youth and community settings, at some point they would have said, yeah, it's just too much. And certainly I've been a background in youth work and outreach work, and there were places that I've worked previously where we would exclude people because there was we felt, you know, that there might be an issue around feeling unsafe or those kind of things. So it's I'm interested to see that, and it strikes me about that kind of organizational behavior actually is the kind of thing that actually does build epistemic trust, because it kind of, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but what it says is that this kind of behavior is going on, but what we see is not just the behavior. We see that the mind that may be in all sorts of turmoil and all sorts of different things going on behind that. And so we certainly see the actions and we take those actions seriously, but that doesn't mean that we're giving up on you. So it's been a lot of young people that have had those kind of very adverse, very, very difficult experiences and feel kind of marginalised, as you said, are used to people just saying that's it. If that's through school exclusion or kind of family breakup or different kind of negative relationships they might have with family members or siblings or whoever it might be. So that strikes me as an extremely powerful kind of idea of, or kind of expression of how you do build epistemic trust. So,
and I mean, I don't know if I can try and give a really brief example of this. So it's not that there hasn't been difficult behaviour to manage at all.
Yeah.
I can think of one example of a young man who was taking part in one of our programs, was homeless at the time, in some debt with some let's call them unsavory characters, had a child already, I think, had just had a child at the time. Cut a long story short, some electrical goods went missing. Kind of was the last person with him, called him up to ask if he'd seen it, and kind of came clean that he was in a lot of trouble and he needed to take the items and sell them to deal with it. And the conversation that we had afterwards, so we met up, it wasn't a blanket exclusion, so it's kind of a three-pronged approach, like, what's the appropriate action for you to take here, having wronged individual members of staff. It was important that it was tied to staff, because there was work lost and things like that. It wasn't the property per se. Secondly, what were the conditions that led to that behaviour, and having that explanation being quite clear, and then following that, kind of what needs to change then for this to no longer be a risk. And we had that conversation, and there was some very clear drivers and motivators going on: homeless, child on the way, and involved with people who were seeking to exploit him, which was leading to him having exploitative behavior in turn to try and feed the power upwards. And the agreement that we came to was kind of very basic. It was there needs to be an apology to the people that you've wronged, and until those risks are dealt with, we can't all sit here in pretend mode and behave like this is not a risk. So we're going to continue one-to-one work, and you're going to try and work towards some milestones, and after that, then some other privileges will come back. So like unsupervised access to various spaces and stuff like that. And for 2 years, he was working hard on that in a one-to-one relationship that he had established with a worker, stay connected to the organisation, but the patterns of engagement changed. I think that's really, really important to think about things like that when we are talking about exclusion, or where things do go really wrong. But I think knowing that at the extreme, you can handle things like that when risk levels are a little bit lower, and it might lead to you just letting things drift away, or just not, I think that's one of the things that can really fortify you, and knowing that, we shouldn't be letting people just drift away. We can hold the risk. It's not beyond us organisationally. So
I think I'm just thinking of how, and I think there might have been some stuff around that in the chat about your answers. I think would be very different to a statutory organisation who might feel that that would kind of just rule somebody out of a particular being able to do some work. And I'm kind of just really interested in that. Actually, this longitudinal work, which is long, it's relational work that takes time, but it's actually you're building the trust, and trust doesn't just come overnight. Needs to be, that kind of things ebb and flow with young people who have a lot going on. So that's really interesting. I'm just wondering, we've got quite a bit of time left, but if there's any questions that have come up in the chat, and if there's anything that Laura wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I was saying thank you, Andre, really, for what you've shared, especially sharing an example of a situation that came up, because I think people appreciate hearing about it, but in equal measure it's kind of an exposing thing, talking about how you deal with stuff, how you handle stuff. So I'm imagining people have found that really helpful to just have a really honest example, because these things are just never clear cut, are they? But your method around it makes a lot of sense, trying to balance the risk involved, the relationship, and fundamentally still trying to keep a young person moving forward. So it was really nice to hear how that had been handled. I think one question I had when I was listening, and I think it's picked up in the chat a bit, was, you know, knowing a bit your organisation as I do, I know that you do become people who young people have a lot of trust in. And I was just thinking about the flip side of what James said about epistemic trust. You know, what the ways it might be nice to kind of just hear a bit about some of the ways in which you work to support the trust that young people have in you to generalise to others, whether that's people in their sort of personal networks, family, friends, but also whether there's ways in which you kind of use that trust to scaffold relationships that they might need to have, even if they don't necessarily want them, with other agencies that might be potentially having a role in supporting them or their family. So that was my curiosity a bit.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I mean, so I think the conflict one is a really interesting kind of element of all of that, and I guess it's kind of shining through a little bit as a bit of a theme in the things that I'm saying, because yeah, those can be the things that are used to test you as an organization and as a practitioner, and also the things that happen unconsciously to terminate relationships when they start to be a little bit too effective or a little bit too nice, or people are getting too invested in them and they don't fundamentally believe that it's going to work out well. So it's a kind of, I'm gonna end this before I lose, you know, I'm gonna make you lose so I don't lose, that sort of thing, which fundamentally stems from victimization earlier on. You know, it's protective behavior. So I think fundamentally that understanding of how your organization or your team deals with conflict is really important, because there's a lot of impulses or patterns, or, you know, where conflict is seen as always being explosive and terminal. Once conflict occurs, that's it, it's the end. And if I don't end it, then you will. And so if as a team you're able to navigate through conflict with a young person in a way that addresses the needs of both parties, and builds good faith, I think you're doing loads already, you know, whether or not you know it or not. And you know, I said addresses the needs of both parties, and I think part of a significant part of it has to be understanding, or, you know, mentalizing with the young person to understand what were the influences behind that situation, because otherwise there's this idea of kind of symbolic power. I'm not sure if everybody will be familiar with it, but, you know, just this understanding that power is it's not just embedded in like the administrative capabilities, or, you know, muscular physique, or etc. It's also built into the way that we talk, the things that we value, the goals that we outline, and so without that dialogue and that understanding, that mentalization, what in my experience, what tends to happen is young people with experiences of oppression and marginalization take it as you using the symbolic power again to oppress them, to remove legitimacy from them in totality. They shut down, and again things get terminal. So it's really yeah, mentalization and maintaining that throughout periods of conflict is really important. I think beyond that, the mentalization of practitioners helping to mentalize their services to young people is really important. And I kind of started off talking a little bit earlier about the kind of chaotic and confusing institutional kind of impulses that are present, and it just makes organizations incredibly opaque to young people. And so when you work with a young person to help them mentalize an organization from the perspective of their priorities, the law, what you're doing is you're scaffolding their ability to understand other organizations and other bodies of collectives of people with kind of specific purposes. And I think that again is really helpful in helping young people understand how you can predict some of that institutional behavior, and get them to understand they have agency over how it gets used and what they can expect, etc., etc. I think, trying to think if there's anything else, kind of that globalized stuff. I mean, again, kind of touching on agency, I think the other thing is about the whole idea of moving relationships and their proximity to you. So, and you know, that ability, that understanding that, you know, as a young person, even somebody who might have experienced a lot of you know, difficulty, you still have the ability to decide who's close and who's far away, and what, you know, and at least ask how the purpose that you like the various people and organizations to fill, and yeah, discovering and scaffolding young people to realize that sense of agency over their network is incredibly important. And again, once that happens, I think there's a bit more.
I think that's massively helpful because, as you say, again, you know, one of the big themes in AMBIT is, as you've said, when you're a young person that's got a lot going on and you've got a lot of needs, it's just very often the case that you attract the attention of a lot of different agencies in a way that it's not always you choosing to have them as part of your life. And, you know, when James was talking earlier, we might be faced with young people who at a general level find it quite difficult to make sense of other people because of the experiences and access to relationships that they've had.
Mm-hmm.
But also, as we know, for all of us, when stress is high, when emotion's high, you know, as we were saying earlier, we can't think, whether it's anxiety or another feeling. So
Mm-hmm.
we've got the double whammy for young people often of having to make sense of a lot of different people. And I think the power in what you're saying of just helping them to stop and understand, okay, what is it that these people do? What is it that they could offer? And sometimes it is a choice about whether they can take up that help. And other times, as we know, there isn't a choice in terms of statutory involvement. People have to be there for particular reasons. But again, it's not to say that we can't do something to smooth that relationship, or at least get interested in what it would take for a young person to find those people helpful. And again, it's not blaming of the other services.
No.
The rest of it, it's just, as you say, recognizing people are operating in such different contexts, and where your organization might be able to take a particular approach. That's because you've got the conditions to support it, and not all other workers would necessarily have that flexibility around them. But it doesn't mean that they're the bad people and you're the good people. So yeah, I can imagine you've had many a conversation over the years trying to help people make sense of each other in that way, to bring things together a lot more.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Andre. I think it's really interesting to think about the, you know, trying to create agency for young people, and actually giving them that that kind of opportunity, really, just to see that there is, however much it may not seem like they do have some agency, it can be within these very complex professional networks that actually they do have some agency, and it can be, like Laura says, it can be working out which help to try and go with. But it also can be, okay, well, maybe this isn't the right time. But yeah, that was really fascinating.
Somebody has asked specifically, just I think interested in hearing how you do work, or, you know, how you did when you were there, work alongside some of the statutory agencies in your area, perhaps where young people are really finding it difficult to trust, and that might be on a kind of young person by young person basis, or maybe at a general organisational level, just whether you had any thoughts on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, so it's hard to generalize. I think a lot of the kind of relationships that take place with statutory organizations tend to be kind of on a practitioner to practitioner level, and that tends to kind of work the best from my experience at the moment. Yeah, I think the tricky thing that, and we kind of discussed this during training, that we've always experienced, is that there is, you know, we've been talking about power. There are hierarchies of power between organisations of different ilk. As a voluntary sector organisation focused on kind of community agency, you know, not often having their work reinforced by health paradigms or, you know, et cetera, there can be a power imbalance actually between the workers in my previous organisation and statutory bodies, particularly those with statutory responsibility. And so, yeah, I think that's created some really interesting dynamics. I think probably most depressingly, we've tend. Sorry, I'm just going to plug in my laptop. We've tend to, at points, found that we've acted as a bit of a release valve for some agencies, because of our kind of community approach, and our approach to kind of, you know, holding and long-term work. We found, you know, at some points, the relationship has been of support from us to statutory agencies to hold cases which maybe aren't quite at thresholds but still problematic, and kind of that's been met also with a kind of lethargy when we've tried to pass things on or request additional support. So I'd say, you know, the dynamics have been interesting at, I guess, if we're going to talk about things at like an institutional level, or trying to get, you know, more broader agreements or patterns in place, but we tend to overcome that through close relationships between practitioners across those kind of disciplinary boundaries. And I think that's really, I think, yeah, it's been important, and I'll continue to advocate that as the way forward, to use kind of brokerage and kind of relationships to advocate for young people in their cases to move forward, where there can be institutional blockages and silos and all the rest of it. So I guess, yeah, it's that whole idea that disintegration is normal and commonplace, and I think, yeah, we've experienced that, and there are some adaptive ways that we get around it, but I couldn't necessarily put a defining experience on it. Playing politician a bit.
No, there's I was thinking the three of us could have a little look at the couple of questions that have come through, because they're really good question from somebody who's saying their organisation has moved from working in a much more ongoing support role with young people to being more focused on shorter term, sort of 6 to 12 week programmes. And I suppose, yeah, ideas from us about how within that shorter time frame you can still use some of these ideas to build worthwhile relationships. I think is a really good question, because I think, again, for many teams and workers, they would really like to be able to have you know, the opportunity to work with young people for a long time, because they recognise that can be what it takes. But I think we probably, between us, also all had experiences of being able to use some of these ideas in a shorter term way, particularly linking to what James said at the beginning. I guess being able to tune in as quickly as you can to what it is that the young person might really be wanting and needing right now can be quite a helpful way of helping to speed up that process of them feeling got and therefore a bit interested in what you've got to offer. But that would be my starter question, because I think there are definitely things that you can do to support young people on a short-term basis, but it might vary as to how central your relationship becomes in that, or the extent to which you establish a bit of trust in order to think with them about who else might be around that can help or does help. Awareness of that. But I don't know what you guys think.
I was just going to say, I've been keeping a half an eye on the chat, and one of the things that's been coming up is the AMBIT practice of broadcasting your intentions. Kind of really clear about what the purpose of you is. And I guess that, I think, you know, my experience with Andre and working with him has been that's what I was very good at doing that. But so that becomes even more acute when you're in a kind of a short-term setting, that you really need to do that very quickly, because otherwise the chances of having a not trusting experience are really quite high. So this idea of, you know, I think as professionals we often think we make a lot more sense than we actually do. So really clear that, you know, this is the reason why I'm sat here, or this is what's going on. And I think that can be an experience of a lot of people we've got going back to this integration idea, where they have multiple people, they're never quite sure why this particular person is coming to see them on that particular day, for example.
And I guess you can be quite goal focused within that still, because it might be being realistic, you know, when you are broadcasting your intentions and thinking with the young person to get a shared understanding of what is possible to do within that time, because there might be one thing that's really important to them that you can help with. And that might be something you create afresh from scratch with each young person, or you might find that you've got some general programs that do particular things really well. And because of the fact that you do them a lot and you have a really kind of clear route into them, it works well for young people because it's something a bit more structured and they can manage it. But I suppose even if you've only got a short amount of time, you could be working out, well, is there somebody in this person's network who they already trust that actually, if that trusted person introduced them to me running this short-term program, or they knew I was involved in it in some way, shape or form, maybe the trust I already had in that person would rub off on me as the kind of new helper on the scene. That could be another way of thinking about it, sort of reversing the trust, like exploit what's already out there rather than feeling under pressure to create it yourself from scratch.
Yeah,
hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Could I just add in as well? I think, you know, one of the really interesting things about this specific point in time is that internationally there's this kind of, we're being shook out of this pretend mode. You know, for you know, the last 11 years of my practice, it's been incredibly hard to say the word racism without it feeling really awkward. And if you can try and imagine what that looks like to somebody who's experienced it, that actually every service that you walk into, everybody is in the same pretend mode where one of your kind of key and defining experiences is impossible to get acknowledged. I think that's going to be a huge barrier to trust, and you know, the same is going to apply to young people from working class backgrounds, you know, women, or you know, people with different sexual or gender identities, and so I think there is something there as well about, you know, what the signals, what does your service or what does your organization say about the world, and does it acknowledge what's wrong with it, and what are some of the experiences that people might have gone through for you know, the wealth of things to be going wrong. Maybe it's a tough thing, but I think it's helpful to think about, and I guess that's in my previous organization, that's always been the strength of ours, is that, you know, we have had the space to say some of those things. We probably still didn't say as much as we should have. But I think there is something there about, you know, how does your service acknowledge the lived experience of the people that it's working with, and are there ways that actually you are in pretend mode and you're missing things.
Andre, I want to say a massive thank you to you. We've sort of come to the end now, about 6:30, but just to say thank you for especially your comments just there. I think they're really timely and really welcome. It's something that I think, you know, the kind of work that you've been doing, I think has got a lot of learning to be had from a lot of other organisations in how they go about working with marginalised groups. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. You've been fantastic, and thank everybody for coming into the webinar today. Just a quick note to say that please do check out our manual, which is if you just type into Google Anna Freud manuals, and you can find AMBIT there, and also you can follow us on Twitter. I think it's AMBIT Anna Freud, and that will come up. So, and please do join us in a couple of weeks for the next webinar. But yeah, just to say thank you very much to everybody. Thanks to all the team, and big thank you to Andre. Okay, I hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot.